Struggled as a single dad after my wife died. SIL helped, then tried taking my kids. Filed for custody claiming I'm unfit. I'm David, 38 years old, and let me tell you, things got rough after my wife, Laura, passed away. Being a single dad ain't easy, especially with my two kids, Maria, who's 10, and Jason, who's 7. I work down at a small construction company here in town, always been the type to roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty, whether it's on a job site or at home. Laura and we were a solid pair for 12 years, married, raising our kids, keeping the house going, just tackling life together. It was hectic sometimes, but we were happy. She was everything to me. Laura had a part-time job teaching, but she was the real backbone of our family, holding it all together. Then, bam, earlier this year, she was gone, just 36 years old. They said it was a heart condition nobody caught, and one morning, she didn't wake up. I can't even describe it, like the whole world caved in, and I was left trying to figure out how to keep standing without the woman who made my life work. Everything turned upside down after that. I've got my job, sure, but raising kids solo was a whole different beast. Maria got real quiet, shut herself off. She started waking up from nightmares but wouldn't say a word about what was bothering her. Jason, though, he went the other way, started causing trouble at school, ignoring his homework, just being a little rebel. I was lost, barely keeping myself together, and now I had to play mom and dad while still bringing home a paycheck. It was chaos. I cut back my hours at work to be there for them more, but I still felt like I was coming up short every day. That's when Alan, my sister-in-law, stepped into the picture. She's Laura's younger sister, 34, married to a fella named George. They don't have kids of their own, and it's not because they didn't want them. Alan's had a hard time with that. She tried those in vitro fertilization treatments a few times, but nothing ever panned out. I could tell it ate at her, especially since she always looked at Laura's life like it was some golden standard. She'd drop little hints over the years, saying how Laura had it all: kids, a good husband, a job that didn't keep her away from home too much. I reckon Alan thought that's what she was meant to have, but it never happened for her. I didn't dwell on it much back then, just let it slide, but now I think maybe I should have seen it coming. After Laura died, Alan offered to pitch in with the kids, and I was in such a haze, I didn't think twice. I needed the help bad. She'd come by, cook some food, wash clothes, handle stuff around the house I couldn't keep up with. She'd take Maria and Jason out to the park or just spend time with them while I wrestled with work and keeping our place from turning into a disaster zone. It felt like she cared, and maybe she did at first. But after a while, something didn't feel right. She started throwing these comments my way, picking at how I was doing things. She'd say stuff like, "Ain't you working too much, David?" or "Those kids need somebody around all the time." I figured she was just fretting, but then she started calling shots for Maria and Jason without even asking me. She'd say Maria needs this thing or Jason's gotta have that, and if I didn't go along with it, she'd give me this look like I didn't know my own kids. I knew Alan always wanted to be a mom, felt sorry for her, I did, but it started feeling like she was trying to take over Laura's role, and not just to help me out. She even suggested the kids should stay over at her place more, which struck me as odd, but I thought maybe she was just doing her best to lend a hand. Things really went south later on, and that's when I saw how far she'd crossed the line. Alan kept pushing harder. She started chatting with Maria and Jason about spending more time at her house, like it was some big plan. She'd say things to them like, "Wouldn't it be great to stay with Aunt Alan? You'd get your own rooms, and I'd be there all day." Maria looked confused by it, and Jason, being little, didn't really get what was happening, but their kids, they liked the sound of extra fun and attention over there. That wasn't all, though. Alan started bad-mouthing me right in front of them. She'd tell Maria I was too tied up with work to care about them, or she'd hint to Jason that he was acting wild because I wasn't watching him close enough. I was giving it everything I had, but it felt like she was shoving me out of my own family. She acted like she had all the answers, like she was meant to be the one raising my kids instead of me. The straw that broke the camel's back came one day when I caught her talking on the phone to George. She didn't know I was close by, but I heard her say she reckoned her and George ought to adopt Maria and Jason. Said I wasn't cutting it, that the kids needed a steady home she thought I couldn't give them. I was boiling mad. This wasn't about helping no more, she was out to take my kids. I couldn't sit quiet after that. I marched right up to her that day and let her have it. Things got loud quick. I demanded to know what she thought she was doing, scheming to adopt my kids behind my back. She didn't even try to dodge it, just dug in, saying she was only looking out for Maria and Jason's best. She threw it in my face, saying I was neglecting them, too focused on my job, and they needed somebody there full-time. I couldn't believe my ears. I told her straight I'm their dad, and she's got no business even thinking about taking them from me. She shot back, saying if I didn't shape up, she'd call Child Protective Services and report me for neglect. I was floored. Alan, who I thought was my lifeline, was now threatening to rip my family apart. After that blowout, I knew I had to put a stop to her running the show. I told her to back off. Maria and Jason weren't going to her place no more unless I said so. She didn't take it kindly, and from there, everything just snowballed. She wasn't kidding around either. A few days later, some legal papers showed up at my door. Alan had gone and filed for emergency custody of my kids. In those papers, she said I wasn't fit to raise them, pointing to my long hours at work and claiming I wasn't there for them emotionally. I was in a panic. I scrambled to find a lawyer, not even sure how to fight back against her accusations. It's not like I could just quit my job. I needed to keep a roof over our heads. But she'd put together this whole story against me, and it felt like she might actually pull it off. I was scared to death I'd lose my kids. I'm asking around for advice because I'm at my wit's end. I'm trying as hard as I can, but maybe it ain't enough. Is Alan onto something? Am I letting my kids down as a dad? How do I keep them safe and hold my family together? Update 1: After the shock of Alan's custody filing sank in, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to stand up and fight. She wasn't taking my kids without a battle. My lawyer said we needed solid proof I wasn't neglecting Maria and Jason, so I got to work on that. First thing, I changed up my hours at the job. I trimmed them down even more, made sure I was home early to get the kids from school myself, sit with them for supper, and tuck them in at night. I brought in a part-time nanny too, somebody they knew and liked, to cover the after-school stretch when I couldn't be there. It wasn't about stepping back as their dad. I just wanted the court to see I was serious about giving them a steady home. Plus, I signed Maria and Jason up for grief counseling. Losing their mom hit them hard, and I hadn't realized how much they were hurting inside. The counselor was a good one, and I started noticing a change, especially in Maria. She was coping better. As for Alan sticking her nose in more and more, I kept track of it all. Every time she said something about my parenting or tried to call the shots for the kids without asking, I wrote it down. I held on to every text and email too, anything to show how she was twisting things. I even asked folks around me to back me up. The guys I work with, some clients, and the kids' teachers, they all knew what I was dealing with and saw me trying my hardest. They said they'd speak up for me or write letters if it came to that. Having people in my corner gave me a spark of hope I could beat this, but Alan wasn't slowing down. She just kept ramping things up. Alan wasn't letting up, and it was plain to see she was getting antsy. She took to social media, tossing out lies about me, making me sound like some guy who cared more about his job than his own kids. She'd write these sneaky, mean posts about how certain folks shouldn't be parents if they can't put their children first. She didn't call me out by name, but anybody who knew us could figure it out real quick. That wasn't enough for her, though. She started working on the family too. She'd feed them twisted stories, saying I was always at work and hardly ever home for Maria and Jason, leaving out how I was busting my tail to still be there for them whenever I could. Next thing I know, some relatives were ringing me up, all worried, asking if maybe Alan had a point. It felt like she was turning my own kin against me, and that made everything feel 10 times heavier. But the worst of it? She started messing with my kids' heads. She told Maria I was planning to ship her off to some boarding school. Pure nonsense. One night, Maria came to me crying, asking if I didn't want her around anymore. I was steaming mad that Alan would do that to her. Then she went after Jason, telling him I was upset with him, that his trouble at school was because I wasn't paying him enough mind. I had to pull both of them aside and set things straight, tell them Alan was making stuff up. It was tough, though. They were already shook up from losing their mom, and now their aunt was stirring the pot even more. The first court hearing snuck up on me faster than I thought it would. Alan's lawyer came in swinging, laying out all this so-called proof that I wasn't taking care of my kids right. They had pictures of my house looking like a tornado hit it because, let's be real, it gets messy sometimes when you're raising 2 kids alone. They brought up times I missed school stuff too, back when I was still reeling from Laura passing. Alan got up there and talked about how rough the kids were having it, acting like I was the reason they were hurting, not the fact they'd just lost their mother. When my turn came, my lawyer laid out what I'd been doing. I showed them how I'd changed my work hours, got a nanny to help out, and put Maria and Jason in counseling to deal with their grief. I even had notes from their teachers saying the kids were starting to get back on track, bit by bit. The judge didn't settle it right then. He wanted folks to check out my home and talk to the kids first. It wasn't done, but at least I had a shot to prove I was giving it my all as their dad. Right in the thick of it, somebody I didn't expect piped up: Angela, Laura's best friend from way back in high school. We'd kept in touch over the years, but I hadn't seen much of her since the funeral. She called me up, said she'd been watching this mess unfold and couldn't sit quiet no more. She was downright ticked off at Alan and wanted to help me out however she could. Angela spilled some things I hadn't known. She said Alan had always been green with envy over Laura, not just because of the kids, but her whole life. She told me about talks they'd had where Alan griped about how unfair it was that Laura had it all while she couldn't even have a baby. After Laura died, Angela said Alan started saying odd stuff, like she figured it was her chance to step in and take over Laura's spot as a mom. Angela offered to speak up for me in court, and honestly, that felt like a rope thrown to a drowning man. She knew Alan inside and out, and she could show the judge this wasn't about the kids' sake, it was Alan chasing after the family she'd always wanted. One night, as I was putting Maria to bed, she looked up at me with those big eyes and said, "Dad, I don't want to go live with Aunt Alan. I want to stay here with you." It tore me up, seeing how scared she was. Both my kids just wanted to be with me, but Alan was making them doubt everything. Update 2, the big custody trial day finally rolled around, and I can't even tell you how wound up I was. I tried to keep it cool for Maria and Jason, but inside, I was a wreck. If Alan won, I didn't know how I'd handle losing them. Her lawyer kicked things off by painting me as some frazzled dad who couldn't keep a steady home, too busy with work to look after my own. She went on this big emotional spiel about how the kids were struggling since Laura passed and needed somebody there all the time to help them through it. Alan, naturally, said she was the one for the job. They even hauled in some fancy expert who claimed kids dealing with grief need constant care, and a parent who stays home is the best fix. I saw it coming, but it still hit me hard hearing somebody say I wasn't enough for my own children. Then things turned around when the counselor working with Maria and Jason took the stand. She explained how getting over grief takes time, but she said the kids and I had a tight bond, and they were finding their footing at home with me. She was real clear yanking them away from their dad, the one thing they could still count on, would only make things worse. I thought that'd be the best part of my case, but then something wild happened. George, Alan's husband, said he wanted to talk. He'd been quiet this whole time, and I barely knew the guy, I just figured he was backing Alan up. So when he stepped up, I had no clue what was coming. He dropped a bombshell right there under oath. George said he was real worried about how Alan was acting. He told the court that lately, she'd gotten fixated on being Maria and Jason's mom. He said she'd always had a hard time with how perfect Laura's life seemed, even admitted she was jealous back when Laura was alive. He laid it out: Alan wanting to adopt my kids wasn't about helping them, it was about filling some hole in her own life, tied to her not being able to have babies and her own sorrow. George said he didn't agree with her filing for custody, that she'd done it behind his back. He was fretting over her headspace, said she wasn't in any shape to take on 2 kids who'd just lost their mom. Alan looked like she'd been knocked flat, and I saw the judge's face change too. It was a big hit to her side, and everybody in that room could feel it. Things got even heavier when it came time for Maria to speak. The judge wanted to hear from both kids, but since they're young, they didn't have to face the courtroom. A child advocate talked to them somewhere private, and those talks got played for the court. Maria, my quiet little girl, was strong. She told them she wanted to stay with me. She said she cared about Aunt Alan, but she felt safe and loved at home with her dad. She talked about how I'd been there, picking her up from school, and how we were working things out together, step by step. She even said the counseling was helping her with missing her mom. When they asked about Alan, Maria said she got mixed up sometimes because Alan kept saying stuff that scared her, like I might send her off somewhere or couldn't take care of her and Jason. But she didn't waver, she wanted to stay home with me, nobody else. Jason's talk wasn't as long since he's younger, but he said the same kind of thing, he loved his dad and wanted to stay put. Hearing them on that recording ripped me up inside. They were frightened and mixed up, but deep down, they knew I'd look after them. When it was all said and done, I was scared stiff, but I felt like we'd given it our best shot. The judge took a couple days to think it over, and when we went back to court, I heard what I'd been hoping for: custody was staying with me. He said I had to keep up the nanny and the counseling, which was fine by me. I'd do whatever it took to keep Maria and Jason safe and happy. For the first time in a while, I could catch my breath. But winning in court didn't mean everything snapped back to normal. I was relieved as all get out after the ruling, but Alan wasn't taking it good. She lost it right there in the hallway afterward, crying, hollering that she was just trying to do right by the kids. George tried to settle her down, but you could tell she felt stabbed in the back, not just by the judge but by him too. Part of me felt sorry for her. I know she wanted kids bad, and maybe she thought she was in the right. But that didn't make what she did okay, and I had to keep telling myself this was about Maria and Jason, not her. Later on, George called me up to say he was sorry for his part in it. He said he'd get Alan some help for her feelings and her mind, but he got it if I wanted space from them for now. I was glad he said it, but I wasn't ready to let it all go. I was still mad about them trying to take my kids. With the trial over, I got to work settling us into a routine again. I kept my work hours loose so I could be there mornings and nights. I started talking more with the kids about how they were feeling, especially Maria. We'd sit down regular like and check in. It wasn't always smooth, sometimes she'd clam up, but I think it showed her I wasn't going anywhere. That's where we're at now. I don't know when I'll have more to say, but I'm hoping this is the last of it for a while.